The Edmund Fitzgerald vanished beneath the raging waters of Lake Superior.
The ship broaching to and possibly capsizing, or else just breaking in half and splitting apart.
For 50 years, the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald has been the Great Lakes' most haunting unanswered mystery. Official reports blame the storm or a simple human mistake. But what if all of that is wrong? A new high-resolution scan has finally breached the one place no diver could safely reach, the bridge. And inside that control room, investigators discovered an anomaly no one expected. The Anomaly. 3 decades after the storm that sank the Edmund Fitzgerald, NOAA and the National Weather Service fed the full archive of weather data recorded between November 9th and 11th, 1975, into a modern atmospheric simulation. And the output revealed something investigators had never encountered. The reconstructed storm showed that at exactly 4 in the afternoon of the disaster, 2 separate regions developed winds of unusually high concentrated intensity. One zone crossed 43 knots, and the other exceeded 40. More unexpectedly, these wind pockets appeared over the lake's southeastern sector rather than the northern ridge where storms typically build. And that southeastern sector was precisely the direction the Edmund Fitzgerald was heading. Meteorologically, their placement made no sense. As the Fitzgerald pushed east-southeast, the surrounding wind field strengthened at nearly double the rate recorded by surface stations. By 7 that evening, average wave heights in that quadrant had reached almost 19 feet. Weather reports at the time were accurate for their tools, but they were unable to detect microbursts, directional swells, or compressed high-speed wind lanes forming over open water. By the time the Fitzgerald entered the eastern edge of the anomaly zone, the storm was producing a classic long fetch effect. Lake Superior spans more than 350 miles from west to east, and a sustained wind running that full distance can generate waves far larger than their initial wind speed implies. The simulation showed significant wave averages exceeding 25 feet. But within those averages were extremes. 1 in every 100 waves rose to 36 feet, and 1 in every 1,000 exceeded 46, the height of a 4-story building. Compounding this, the Fitzgerald was traveling east-southeast directly, absorbing the steepest part of these swells head-on. This would have disrupted its natural roll period, preventing the ship from recovering between impacts. Under these conditions, a freighter can become locked in a cycle where it rolls too far, corrects too slowly, and begins taking water on deck. This digital reconstruction was no longer just a theory. It found its validation in the recorded testimony of the only other ship in a position to witness the catastrophe. Observations from the Arthur M. Anderson, trailing the Fitzgerald by several miles, aligned almost exactly with the model. Around the time the simulation indicated peak winds, the Anderson recorded sustained speeds near 57 miles per hour. The model calculated 54, remarkably close given the decades separating the events and the simulation. It also showed another wind peak at the Fitzgerald's final known position, sustained winds approaching 70 miles per hour, with gusts rising toward 86. That is near hurricane strength, and it occurred at the moment the ship disappeared from radar. When researchers examined the storm's wind vectors along the Fitzgerald's last route, they found an unusual shape. The 2 high-speed zones appeared to converge into a funnel-like corridor rather than dispersing across the lake as expected. The Fitzgerald sailed directly into this narrowing channel of accelerating wind feeding the eastern basin. The model had revealed the storm's hidden architecture, a freakish, accelerating trap set directly in the Fitzgerald's path. This pattern mirrored what the Anderson's crew observed from a distance, an extraordinary wind forming at an unnatural point and waves that seemed to move with intention. Yet their eyewitness account included something beyond the reach of any model. But the model could not capture the human horror. What exactly did the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson see in those final violent minutes? The answer to that question, and the other shocking discoveries that followed, lie ahead. The Three Sisters. Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson reported that around 6:30 that evening, his ship was struck by two massive waves, each capable of deforming steel structures on a 700-foot freighter. The first wave buried the aft cabins, smashing a lifeboat with enough force to push it down onto its cradle. A second wave, just as large, then crashed over the bridge deck. Cooper estimated their height at 30 to 35 feet, but later admitted they might have been higher. He knew these waves were headed directly toward the Fitzgerald, which was directly ahead of him in the storm. Unlike ordinary rogue waves, the Three Sisters are a set of three consecutive massive breakers. They form when wind and wave dynamics align to stack wave trains. The first wave buries the deck. Before that water can drain, the second arrives, adding to the load. Then the third strikes, overwhelming the vessel. While dangerous in any sea, this phenomenon is particularly catastrophic on the Great Lakes. Ocean swells are longer and roll under a ship, but freshwater waves are shorter and faster, with periods of 4 to 8 seconds compared to 10 to 16 at sea. A freighter has barely a moment to recover from one impact before the next one hits. A cycle veteran lake mariners describe as being like a set of doors slamming shut. The Three Sisters theory gained dramatic credibility during a test for the 2010 television series Dive Detectives. At the National Research Council's Wave Basin in St. John's, a scale model of the Edmund Fitzgerald was subjected to a simulated 56-foot rogue wave. The result shocked engineers. The model didn't just tilt. It submerged completely, its bow vanishing beneath the surface. In a real-world scenario, this would have sent a wall of water hammering down the deck, overwhelming the hatches and forcing the hull into an extreme, potentially unrecoverable bend. Experts analyzing the 1975 storm believe the Fitzgerald may have been struck not by one, but by a sequence of 2 or 3 such waves, potentially up to 60 feet high, precisely the conditions predicted inside the storm's funnel-like wind corridor. If the Fitzgerald was already slowed, listing or carrying water on deck, these sequential impacts would have had an exponentially greater effect. Cooper later admitted that after his ship was hit, he feared what was coming. He knew those waves had a direction, a target, and he knew the Fitzgerald was in that zone. The convergence of evidence points to a single devastating conclusion. The Edmund Fitzgerald was likely caught in a trap of consecutively timed colossal waves. It has been confirmed that the Three Sister waves are deadly, and no ship prays to encounter them. But one might begin to wonder, does encountering them always mean total damnation, or is there more to this story? Has anyone survived the Three Sisters waves? In 1966, the SS Daniel J. Morrell, a 603-foot freighter, encountered rogue wave conditions near Thunder Bay and literally broke in half. Yet the bow section remained afloat for over 30 minutes, long enough for one crew member to escape on a raft. This survival occurred despite the Morrell having a weaker hull design than the Edmund Fitzgerald. A more direct comparison can be made with the SS Wilfred Sykes. In November 1975, the same month the Fitzgerald sank, the Sykes encountered waves nearly identical to those reported near Whitefish Bay. It was pounded by waves higher than anything its captain had ever seen, with its bow pulpit repeatedly vanishing into deep troughs. The ship suffered heavy damage but arrived in port battered and intact. These vessels shared a critical commonality. They endured extreme violence. They were torn, dented, and bent, but they remained on the surface long enough to save their crews. Those shaken survivors provided first-hand accounts of the ordeal. The sudden blackness as water engulfed the bridge windows, the deafening groan of overstressed steel, and the sickening vibration of a hull flexing beyond its limits. This is why the Fitzgerald's sinking stands out so sharply. The storm was brutal, yes, and the waves were unprecedented. But other ships had survived similar conditions, and in some cases, worse ones. This simple fact leads to an inescapable conclusion. If Fitzgerald faced a known threat that others had weathered, then a second critical factor must have turned a survivable event into a catastrophic one. This leaves a single haunting question. What hidden flaw, what fatal vulnerability did the Edmund Fitzgerald possess that these other ships did not? A ship built to survive. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was a 17-year marvel of American industry, a vessel marked from its very first day by both spectacle and strange misfortune. Conceived as the first Laker built to the maximum St. Lawrence Seaway size, her dimensions were monumental. A 729-foot hull with a 26,000 long-ton capacity. Her 3 cargo holds were loaded through 21 watertight hatches, and over her career she covered over 1 million miles, the equivalent of 44 trips around the world. This $7 million investment, nearly $60 million today, was reflected in her surprising luxury. Designed by the J.L. Hudson Company, her quarters featured deep pile carpeting, tiled bathrooms, and leather swivel chairs. She had air-conditioned crew quarters, a fully stocked galley, and even VIP staterooms where passengers were served candlelit dinners. Yet beneath this opulence was legendary strength: a double-bottom hull, reinforced plating, and a power system that could push through 20-foot waves. She was continually improved with a bow thruster and oil-fired boilers, a vessel designed to last half a century. Yet from her first day, an eerie shadow followed her. Misfortunes plagued her 1958 launch. The christening bottle took 3 swings to break, a spectator died of a heart attack, and the ship crashed into a pier upon entering the water. This pattern continued throughout her career with a series of groundings, collisions, and mishaps, forming a cryptic resume of incidents that belied her sturdy reputation. The Fitzgerald still became a beloved celebrity, thanks largely to her longtime master, Captain Peter Pulser. He was famous for piping music over the ship's intercom and entertaining crowds at the Sulaks with a bullhorn, turning the industrial Leviathan into a floating DJ booth. But for her final voyage, command fell to another seasoned master, Captain Ernest McSorley. He was among the most respected on the lakes, a disciplined and famously careful sailor with over 4 decades of experience. And yet, on November 10, 1975, as the storm intensified and visibility collapsed, McSorley made a decision that still puzzles investigators. He kept the Fitzgerald moving at full speed. With the ship already damaged and both radars lost, he knew they were in trouble. But on Lake Superior in a November gale, slowing down can be more dangerous than powering forward. A freighter needs speed to climb waves and maintain steering control. To lose momentum is to risk broaching, turning sideways to the waves, which is almost always fatal. His decision was a calculated run for the safety of Whitefish Bay, the only logical choice left. But here's the key point. Nothing in his final radio transmissions indicated panic or catastrophic flooding. There were no pleas for help. His last recorded words were, "We are holding our own." This doesn't align with the ship slowly succumbing to waves. McSorley was experienced enough to know the warning signs, but he gave none. That leads to the uncomfortable truth. If Fitzgerald was as strong as her reputation, and she was, something abnormal had to have happened. A sudden failure. A collapse so rapid that the ship didn't have time to signal distress. The ship's secret. In 1969, the Fitzgerald underwent a dramatic transformation, a lengthening that stretched her from 710 feet to an even more imposing 729. But behind the improved capacity was a question no one dared to fully confront. Did the modification introduce a hidden vulnerability in the hull's strength, one that only the worst possible storm could reveal? The U.S. Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board launched extensive inquiries. By 1976, their Curve 3 submersible had located the wreck. Not a single intact ship, but 2 massive sections separated by 170 feet of dark water. The bow sat upright, deeply embedded in the lake bed. The stern was overturned, its propeller shafts and keel structure grotesquely exposed. Based on this, the Coast Guard's 1977 casualty report concluded the ship must have sunk intact, breaking apart only upon hitting the bottom. The NTSB announced that, laying out the logic, a surface breakup would have left the wreckage in a different configuration. But independent researchers weren't convinced. The Great Lakes had claimed ships before, and several, like the Carl D. Bradley in 1958 and Daniel J. Morrell in 1966, had snapped on the surface. To many, the Fitzgerald appeared to be the next in this unfortunate lineage. This official conclusion was soon challenged. The first major counter-argument came from historian Frederick Stonehouse, who analyzed footage from a 1989 ROV survey. He was puzzled by the wreck site. The forward section was blanketed with taconite pellets that should not have been there if the ship sank intact. Stonehouse argued the stern must have stayed afloat long enough to spill its cargo onto the descending bow, an event that could only happen if the Fitzgerald split on the surface. This theory gained definitive support from the 1994 Shannon expedition. Their high-resolution imaging revealed that the bow and stern were separated by 255 feet, far more than initially thought, and that the wreck's placement in the clay indicated the stern had rolled over on the surface. To Shannon, the evidence was conclusive. The ship tore apart in the storm, its final moments defined by a catastrophic structural failure, not a deep-water impact. This possibility brought new attention to the 1969 lengthening. Naval architects had warned for years that stretch jobs altered a ship's bending characteristics. A longer hull flexes more in the brutal cycles of hogging, where the hull is bent upward amidships, and sagging, where it is bent downward. If the Fitzgerald was already stressed by earlier damage or hidden weld fatigue, then the Three Sisters could have delivered the final intolerable blow. The theory is as unsettling as it is plausible. The Great Lakes' most famous freighter may have been undone not by an external gash, but by the quiet compromise of steel altered 6 years before the storm ever arrived. It suggests that Fitzgerald wasn't merely a victim of the lake. She may have been her own anomaly, carrying a weakness born in a shipyard long before the first wave struck. But the lake itself held another, more insidious clue, one that pointed not to a flaw in the ship, but to a trap on the bottom. The Phantom Wound. According to the Lake Carriers Association, the freighter may have unknowingly crossed the 6-fathom shoal, a shallow ridge northwest of Caribou Island. During the height of the November 10 storm, the Whitefish Point light and radio beacon were out of service, leaving McSorley to navigate through darkness, heavy snow, and winds that routinely erased radar returns. In those conditions, drifting even a half-mile off the intended course could mean disaster. A Canadian hydrographic survey in 1976 provided unexpected support for this theory. Chartmakers discovered that the shoal extended almost a mile farther east than previously recorded. Arthur M. Anderson's officers had already testified that the Fitzgerald passed directly across this newly charted section, and the timing matched the moment when McSorley radioed that fences and railings on his deck had been smashed loose. Supporters argued that such damage was consistent with hogging, a stress pattern caused when a ship's bow and stern hang off the edges of a submerged ridge while the center is forced upward. If the Fitzgerald had raked across the shoal, the sudden upward bend might have torn deck structures apart, opened seams, and triggered rapid flooding long before the crew understood what had happened. But when divers searched the shoal shortly after the disaster, they found no sign that a 13,000-ton vessel had collided with anything. The lakebed showed no fresh scarring, no disturbed sediment, no displaced rock, nothing consistent with a recent grounding. Later, when expedition leader John Shannon captured high-resolution images of the overturned stern in 1994, the evidence against the shoaling theory became even stronger. The rudder, propeller, and underside of the stern showed no deformation or gouging. There were no scrape marks, no dents, no telltale abrasions that would indicate the hull had ever come into contact with an underwater obstacle. The area of the ship that should have displayed the most damage was almost pristine. This theory also drew skepticism because it conveniently removed responsibility from every major stakeholder. If the lakebed itself was at fault, then the shipping companies, the American Bureau of Shipping, and the Coast Guard were absolved of any role in the loss. especially since Captain Cooper had accused the Coast Guard of being indifferent on the day of the wreck. To many independent researchers, it seemed the lake's behavior was being used to obscure potential errors in vessel design or oversight. Some investigators, unwilling to abandon the grounding explanation entirely, turned to alternative scenarios. One of the most detailed came from Professor Paul Hainault, who suggested that the Fitzgerald had struck Superior Shoal, an underwater mountain complex with peaks rising dangerously close to the surface. His hypothesis incorporated the Seichi, a massive storm-driven standing wave that raised water levels 3 feet at the Sulaks that same day, and proposed that the unusual water displacement might have pushed the Fitzgerald onto the shoal earlier that morning, creating a structural failure in the ship's midsection. In this model, the hull would have been fatally weakened long before the final radio message. But again, the wreckage did not match the required damage. No mid-body puncture existed, no collapsed plates were visible, and no trace of a shoaling event appeared anywhere on the lake floor. The more investigators looked, the clearer the truth became. The Fitzgerald did not suffer the catastrophic gash that shoaling theories depended on. The phantom wound was never found. And with that absence, one of the most widely accepted explanations for the disaster evaporated almost entirely. But if the lake itself was conspiring against the Fitzgerald, it may have had a hidden ally, something that ensured the great ship was not just blind, but utterly lost. The human factor. At the center of the catastrophe were 29 men making decisions in the dark, under pressure, and against a clock they could not see. While the physical forces that sank the Edmund Fitzgerald are measured in wind speeds and wave heights, the final human choices in the hours before she vanished form a shadow theory, one that suggests the crew may have been contending with the limits of human endurance itself. Captain Ernest McSorley was a legend. With 44 years of experience, he was the kind of master mariner who inspired confidence. He was cautious, respected, and knew the Fitzgerald as well as anyone. His decision to take the northern route along the Canadian shore, skirting the worst of the forecasted storm, was initially a sound one. But as the day wore on, the storm defied prediction. It intensified faster and tracked farther north than any model had anticipated, placing the Fitzgerald directly in its path. At 63, McSorley was nearing the end of a long, celebrated career. This voyage on the Fitzgerald was meant to be his last. He had already purchased a retirement home in Florida, but this final run was shadowed by a personal crisis. His wife, Nellie, was seriously ill. For McSorley, the urgency to reach port transcended cargo schedules and company expectations. Every hour of delay was an hour of anguish. The warmth of Whitefish Bay wasn't just shelter, it was a step closer to home, to a sick wife, and to a long-awaited retirement that was finally within reach. This context transforms his decisions from mere tactics into acts of profound personal determination. The known facts of the storm create a scenario that would test any captain. But for McSorley, the psychological pressure was multiplied. The get-home-itis that mariners speak of wasn't just professional pride. It was a deeply personal, desperate need to get home. Modern studies of crisis management reveal that even seasoned experts suffer from impaired judgment under extreme stress and fatigue. For McSorley, this was compounded by the unrelenting anxiety for his wife's well-being. Could this all-consuming worry have narrowed his perception, a phenomenon known as cognitive tunneling? Was his decision to press on in a damaged and listing ship influenced by a fatigue-induced and emotionally charged drive to simply end the journey? Inside the Fitzgerald's bridge, the environment had turned hostile long before the hull did. Captain McSorley was now navigating a void. After nearly 20 hours awake, slammed by noise, darkness, and mechanical chaos, he was operating in a state modern studies calls cognitive narrowing, a dangerous involuntary tunnel vision in which the brain clings to familiar cues while losing awareness of everything else. His one remaining cue was the steady voice of Captain Cooper on the Arthur M. Anderson. That dependency may have created a fatal illusion. that if the Anderson was surviving, the Fitzgerald must be surviving too. Even though the storm wasn't hitting them equally, the captain's perception may have fused the two ships into one shared reality, masking his own vessel's accelerating decline. Beneath this lay the more serious threat of task saturation. Every critical duty, checking ballast levels, assessing flooding, and monitoring the list, was now competing with the sheer struggle to keep the ship upright. Under such duress, even experts lose the ability to evaluate risk. They stop seeing trends and start seeing only tasks. Looming beneath the storm was a cultural pressure no chart could ever show. On the Great Lakes, November sailings were a badge of honor. Captains were expected to deliver cargo, to push through storms that would ground lesser mariners. Over the years, this created a phenomenon known as procedural drift, the quiet, insidious normalization of risk. Each successful run lowered the danger threshold by a fraction. Not recklessness, but a confidence built on hundreds of past storms, slowly blurring the line between calculated risk and catastrophe. When the Fitzgerald was damaged, when the list worsened, when the hatches were suspected to be leaking, each was an off-ramp he could have taken. But heaving to in a November gale meant admitting defeat. And for a captain known for command, known for control, known for an unbroken career of getting ships home, speaking that admission over the radio may have been psychologically harder than facing the storm itself. In the end, a ship celebrated for her power became a coffin for 29 exhausted men, making decisions under conditions no mind is built to survive. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.